would you agree with those who say that it's the greatest Catholic work of literature in history?
It is called the great poem, bar none, in Europe itself. And Dante is the great poet. I think it is the greatest poet. And I also believe strongly that every Catholic should read it. It is the greatest work, and I say that as a medievalist. It is the greatest work of Catholic literature. I mean, we all love Augustine, we all love Thomas Aquinas, we all love Hildegard of Bingen and Teresa and Catherine and all of the great writers, Bernard of Clairvaux, Bonaventura, but nothing matches Dante.
My friends, welcome to The Literary Catholic, a program where we unpack life-changing stories from centuries of Catholic literature, connecting you to God and inspiring both your faith and imagination.
Hello, I'm Rafael Pi Roman, and I'm here with Professor of Languages and Literature and Catholic Studies at Sacred Heart University, June-Ann Greeley. Dr. Greeley focuses on late antique and medieval literature and religious spirituality, and she has presented at numerous conferences, and her research has been published widely. Professor Greeley, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here.
Well, Professor, we're going to be talking about Dante Alighieri and his Divine Comedy today. So let's start with the basics. Where and when did Dante live? And could you give us a quick highlights of some of the some aspects of his life that you feel are important?
Sure. So Dante is born in 1285 in a city known as Florence, the Firenze, which is a great city-state at the time. And he is the only son, and eventually he has his mother dies when he's young, but he has a brother and half-brother and sister when his father remarries. And Dante comes from a time when Florence and most of northern Italy is going through a real change with the rise of a merchant class, with the beginnings of trading routes that go as far as what today would be China. There's a lot of wealth and a lot of sort of new ways of thinking about things that are coming into northern Italy, and that's probably why it becomes the hotbed of the Renaissance. And Dante experiences that. So his own father is what you might call a merchant, kind of a middle-class figure. And the idea of sort of shifting values, where suddenly having things, materialism, the power of money, the role of money in people's lives becomes a very new kind of understanding of people in society, and it changes from some of the earlier medieval period. Dante himself was a great student. He was somewhat of an autodidact. He read everything. He loved everything from ancient literature to contemporary theology of the time. And he was someone who was also involved politically. And so he and his family were involved in some of the workings of Florence. He was a much sort of, respected son of Florence, and he loved the city itself. But Dante was somebody who found himself at a crosshairs, and sometime around the 1300s, early 1300s, he finds himself exiled from Florence. And I think to think of the Divine Comedy as an exile poem is really important. He's part of a political faction that loses out in the end to the other political faction. In those days, you got exiled if you didn't have the winning side.
And if you were lucky.
And if you were lucky, exactly, because sometimes the side Dante was on, the Guelphs, the Ghibellines, they would have actually battles that would take place. Right. Imagine that happening today, yeah. Right.
So it was a chaotic time, largely because it was getting wealthier and wealthier. The city was changing.
Right.
So let's talk about the Divine Comedy, his masterpiece, an epic poem divided into 3 books, Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, in that order. Now, the Inferno famously begins with the lines from the Ciardi translation that we have right here. Quote, "In the middle of our life's journey, I woke to find myself in a dark wood, having lost the path that does not stray." Now, obviously, he's not talking about having taken a stroll in the woods and getting lost.
Of course.
What is he talking about?
Well, if we go back to the idea that Dante is writing this in exile, so Dante is sent into exile around 1303, 1304, never to return to Florence, by the way. And once that happened, it was sort of a shock to his system. And he sort of realized after, a year or so of kind of melancholy and trying to find a place, what have I done with my life? Where am I? And he finds himself in a dark wood. Now, is that dark wood a dark wood of depression? Is it a dark wood of being lost to his friends and family? Is it a dark wood of confusion? Is it a dark wood of suddenly realizing that he didn't know himself as well as he did, or maybe he thought he was something he wasn't? A dark wood of sort of a sense of loss. The important thing,
the dark wood of moving away from the righteous path to the
righteous path. He was always somewhat religious in the sense that he loved his faith and he loved the theology. I can't say that he was necessarily the best, the most responsible churchgoer and that kind of thing, but certainly finding himself bereft and feeling, especially since he had been of the party of the Pope and feeling, I don't know, did I do something wrong? All of that he begins to lose. And as you point out in Ciardi's translation, it rightly says, midway through our lives. Right. So Dante makes very clear that while this is his story, it's really meant for all of us to reflect on because it is part of all of our stories.
Yeah. Well, whichever way you interpret it, I think it becomes clear as you read that it's about our movement of spiritual redemption and ultimate salvation, and the path that takes us to that. So given the place and the time where the poem was written, that, of course, means that it was deeply Catholic.
Yes.
Can the poem be understood in any meaningful way without assuming that?
I think it can. I mean, if you're a modern person, if you're not a Catholic person, I think there's enough in Dante. It is deeply Catholic. It is deeply spiritual, but it's also psychological. It has a lot of history. It has a lot of mythology and legends. And the story of being lost, the story of losing one's way, I think resonates with everybody. So even if you're not somebody who understands, I mean, we all know, I mean, if you know the book, he goes into lots of doctrine. He goes into a lot of detail about a lot of teachings of the church, and that might not work for some people. But the idea of having to look at some of the darker sides of ourselves, the idea of having to kind of find a way to redemption, but that redemption's on us, as we learn in Purgatorio, and then find a way to God, or if you're not a believing person, find a way to the light, to sort of wholeness, to help your brokenness. I think it very much can resonate and work for everyone. Some passages might not be as understandable as others, but absolutely it works for everyone.
Even though it works for everyone, would you agree with those who say that it's the greatest Catholic work of literature in history?
It is called the great poem, bar none, in Europe itself. And Dante is the great poet. I think it is the greatest poet. And I also believe strongly that every Catholic should read it. It is the greatest work. And I say that as a medievalist. It is the greatest work of Catholic literature. I mean, we all love Augustine. We all love Thomas Aquinas. We all love Hildegard of Bingen and Teresa and Catherine and all of the great writers, Bernard of Clairvaux, Bonaventura. But nothing matches Dante for its breadth, for its depth, for its honesty. He's a layperson. He was never really attached to the church. And so this idea that, and yet he carries in some of all the theological and spiritual teachings, and the idea that he's trying to make sense of all that while yet being in the world. And I think one of the things that happens in Italy at that time, because it's becoming so worldly and secularized, is that question, how do we retain our deep faith and our Catholic understanding while in a world that even then was kind of, working against that?
So that brings me to the next question.
Sure.
Some people say, well, how could it be the greatest Catholic poem in history when so much of it is a searing attack not only on the secular hierarchy of his time, but particularly of the spiritual hierarchy of his time, of the Catholic Church at the very top? How do you answer that?
Well, I suppose we could also talk to the Jesuits about being able to ask the questions. But remember that Dante is living in the Middle Ages. And in the Middle Ages, the Pope was not infallible. I mean, that's a 19th century teaching. The Pope was in some ways as worldly in some cases as any secular ruler. And I think for Dante, his love for the church was so profound. And he has some moving passages and just exquisite text that when now again, this would be his vantage point, but when he saw, and we know historically a lot of this was true, when he saw what he believed to be, whether it's corruption or misuse or misunderstanding by certain individuals in the church, he felt an obligation to say, and be honest about it, and say, it's not that I reject the papacy. On the contrary, I want that the seat of Peter to be held by truly those chosen by the Holy Spirit. And speaking again as a medievalist, I have to admit, not everybody who was on the seat of Peter at the time was there purely by the Holy Spirit. Let's put it that way.
But who was there by the Holy Spirit, because all things work for the good, was Dante.
Well, it was Dante.
Comedy.
Was Dante, and
because he really was, as you say. I mean, he was a Catholic who wanted to make the Catholicism be what it was,
absolutely,
what it had to be.
Yes.
What was the reaction of the poem by these hierarchies and by the general readership?
Well, this is not to equivocate, but it sort of depends where you are. So Dante's poem has never been out of publication. It has always been published. The laity, secular people who were able to read at the time and thereafter loved it. He was actually welcomed by many members of the church. The only time that it got a little bit dicey for the Divine Comedy, and we might not have this wonderful text, was during the Spanish Inquisition. And in Spain, because of some of the scenes from Inferno where popes are in the Inferno, and some of the scenes where, you know, there's some question as to what he's saying about the church, there was a real pushback. And it was almost put, you know, on the list of censored texts, but luckily it was saved. But I think there's so much beauty in the poetry, in the imagery, and just the story. It's a story of love and light. It's very hard, I think, for anyone to say that it isn't worth having it, you know, there. And for the most part, it sort of was received very well. Now, in terms of the history of reading, it obviously went into somewhat of a decline, kind of 18th century.
But that's all right. But I wanted, but what I was,
but by Catholics,
at the time,
always well accepted. Yeah.
So, you know, let's turn to the specifics
Sure.
of the poem. Aside from Dante, the poem's a major protagonist. The two other major protagonists are his guides. His guides for almost the whole trip, not quite the whole trip, as we'll find out. One of them is Virgil, the author of the Aeneid, and the greatest poet of the height of the
Roman Empire,
under Augustus Caesar, and Beatrice.
Yes.
Who is Beatrice, and why are Beatrice and Virgil the two guides?
Well, Beatrice was a young woman who came from a slightly more well-to-do family than Dante's in Florence. And without getting too much into the details of it, Dante saw her maybe a total of 3 times fleetingly. But supposedly on the Ponte Vecchio, he looked upon her face and fell in love instantly. And his entire life he dedicated to Beatrice. All of his writings, even this poem, but love poems, he gave to Beatrice. And by the time we have Beatrice in the Divine Comedy, she becomes almost a metaphor for kind of divine love, if you will. This young woman, she was an actual person. She died sadly very young. She was married to another, of course. And Dante seems never quite to have gotten over the moment he met her. And so Beatrice represents a kind of purity of love, a kind of innocence of love that can yet move the universe. Virgil, and she's more of that spiritual component, not quite as much as Saint Bernard, but she's really kind of the heart of the story, and in some ways the whole poem is dedicated to her. She's obviously the one who kind of helps Dante in his journey. Virgil, on the other hand, was Dante's favorite Latin poet. He was the author of the Aeneid, who of course figures the same kind of journey into a young man finding himself. And Virgil represents, in a sense, reason or a kind of secular order. Virgil was a poet. He was something of an Epicurean Stoic philosopher in his own way. He wrote the Georgics and some other poetry, and Dante read him all the time. And for Dante, I think both Virgil as a kind of sense of sort of stability, a sense of reason and logic, but also as a poet becomes his guide. And so the two of them walk with Dante. And I do think that idea of making this journey with someone is really important to Dante. Relationships are everything to Dante.
So even people, who have never read the poem know that there are 9 circles of hell.
Yes.
With each succeeding circle representing a graver sin or set of sins with greater punishments. Can you give us a general idea of Dante's hierarchy of sins? You don't have to go step by step, but a general idea. What was the least? What was the most? Sure.
In Inferno primarily. Yes. So Inferno.
In the Inferno.
Yeah, Inferno is interesting because it begins with sort of almost just at the entryway to hell. The first sin you run into, and sometimes I don't even know if Dante considers it a sin, but again, he's on his own journey of enlightenment and understanding, is of course the famous story of Paolo and Francesca in Canto 5. And this would be the sin of lust. So the first 2 sins that really kind of work in the Inferno are these bodily sins, lust and gluttony. Now, I don't know if it's because Dante supposedly enjoyed a good meal and wine and loved ladies and all of that, but he doesn't consider, they are sinful, adultery and sort of, greed and in terms of the body, and then of course greed in terms of money. These are all considered by Dante to be, negative, sort of, spiritually corrupting and negative ways of living one's life. But they don't really work sort of powerfully against the individuals. And famously, Dante himself he cries with Francesca when she tells the story, because he's not yet aware of what it means to be, sinful, or he doesn't quite get that he needs to figure that out. but also because he doesn't quite yet believe it's such a terrible thing. And actually, when you get to Purgatorio, lust is still, it's at the very top. It's the least of the sins, along with gluttony. As you go further into Inferno, the sins become, so you get sins like anger, and then you get sins like heresy, very deeply sin. You get sins like treachery and, of course, fraud. And these are sins that I think have more to do with the corruption of the soul and how that corruption and that kind of loss of the light of God also corrupts society. So the notion that, if you're having an affair, of course it's not good and of course it's not right, especially if you're married, has one set of issues. But by the time you get to sort of the very pit of hell, you've gone through all the horrible people, the murderers, the thieves, and all of these people have done horrible things. But the further down you go, the sins become more sins of how we sort of harm other people, and how our harming other people for our selfish reasons, our anger, our own greed, has more to do with, kind of that disease within us. And so that becomes really Dante's journey.
So what are some of the most interesting characters that Dante meets in hell, and what are some of the most significant events that he and Virgil encounter? And for time's sake,
I'll just mention a few. We have Paolo and Francesca maybe are sort of the most very interesting at the very beginning.
And tell us quickly who they are.
Oh, I'm sorry. So when we first get into Canto 5, in the beginning of the Inferno, Dante runs into this world of cacophony and sound and smell, and he sees these souls flying around, and he runs into two figures, Paolo and Francesca. Now, interestingly enough, Paolo and Francesca, and this actually happened, it was a true story, he didn't make it up. Paolo and Francesca were actually brother-in-law and sister-in-law of a noble family in Florence at the time, and they were married to other people, but they had an affair, and that was quite scandalous at the time. And when Francesca meets up with Dante, and Dante says, "What's brought you here? I can't believe it," because even though everyone knew that she had a scandalous affair, Dante didn't really care. They had an affair. What can you say?
He's Italian.
And Francesca says, "Well, it was because of that medieval text I read about Guinevere and Lancelot." So the notion, that it got us all kind of excited, and I had a kiss, and that was it. And Paolo doesn't say much in it. And then, of course, they end up actually being murdered by her husband, and he is further along in hell.
We know.
But it's a beautiful moment, because Dante, you can see him really unable to pierce through some of his own longings, some of his own kind of misunderstandings. And so as you go through the different levels of hell, you meet different characters. And one of the things I would say about reading Dante is if you get caught up too much in a lot of the names, you have a Chiardi translation, you can always look them up, but try to get a sense of the characters in there. Probably one of the other most famous individuals is the famous scene with Ugolino near the very pit of hell. And Ugolino was a nobleman who, because of political machinations, found himself walled into a room at the top of a tower with his sons. And in order to, depending on how you read the text, but in order to survive, he has to cannibalize his own sons. And when we meet Ugolino, he's kind of stuck in the pit of hell. He's stuck in the ice, and he's being gnawed on by a colleague of his, an archbishop who was involved in some nefarious kind of fraudulent money making with him. And again, even in that scene, Ugolino is unable to accept what he's done. He sort of blames everyone. And then he says at one point, "Well, my sons would have wanted me to eat them so I could survive." And, and Dante by that time is just looking at him going, "Oh my goodness, I don't even know what to say." And then finally, when you get, I don't know if you want to talk about the pit of hell, but
I want to get to that. that. So what does he find? The pit of hell, the ninth circle, the worst of the worst.
Right.
What does he find there?
He finds ice. He finds darkness.
Not fire.
Not fire, no brimstone. It's just ice. It's darkness. And what he sees is this monstrous figure of what we call Lucifer or Satan, but this monstrous figure who's kind of stuck in the ice from his waist up. He has what looked to be, what would have been angel's wings, but are now bat's wings. And he's kind of stuck in this ice and just kind of sitting there. He has no words. So all of the beautiful words Lucifer spoke to kind of, impress people, impress the other angels to come with him. He's now lost it all. And he has a kind of, a Janus face, except it's three-sided. And we have the three greatest traitors, if you want to call them that, of Dante considered in history. You have Judas, and you have Cassius, and you have Brutus. And everyone is just kind of gnawing on each other, and they're just kind of living there, and there's no real sense of anything really happening there. It's almost completely dark, and it's full of stench, but it's frozen world because it's frozen from God's presence and the light of God.
It's terrifying and it's grotesque.
Yes.
But what struck me was this portrayal is so different
Yes.
than the one that we've come to
Yes,
accept.
yes.
Of the almost heroic evil mastermind.
Right.
The haughty rebel. It kind of almost charming, but certainly intelligent, brilliant. Like in Paradise Lost.
Sure.
This is just a dumb beast. It's
Just
like
a
Tyrannosaurus
horrible
Rex.
creature. Exactly. Exactly.
Why was that the typical portrayal of Satan at the time?
Well, actually, at the time, so Dante's living at a time when there are apocalyptic kind of writings happening and the end of the world and what might, sort of places of great torture look like. And generally speaking, not universally, but generally speaking, you do get a little bit more of the sense of either fire or, like cascading rocks or violence of some kind. And there's heat. And there's generally speaking a sense of sort of consumption. And
but of Satan as a stupid beast rather than as a brilliant evil mastermind.
I mean, you could read, for example, at the same time, you could read, let's say, medieval English mystery plays, and Satan. These are plays that were in the Middle Ages that covered the story of the Bible story from the beginning of creation to the very end of Revelation. And Satan is in a lot of them, and he's charming, and he's effervescent, and he's winning everybody over to his side, and he goes out into the people, and he has things to say. This idea of the loss of voice, the loss of, really any kind of sort of, conscious presence, I think, well, it might not be super unique to Dante. I mean, to some degree, the sense that Satan has fallen and he's broken is in a lot of other writings, but there's something very unique about this monstrous bat-winged creature just stuck in ice and unable to do anything.
And he's actually stuck in ice because he's too stupid not to be stuck, because he keeps the ice cold
by flapping his wings, and he's just flapping his wings the way.
It's good to know that Satan's a moron. It's unfortunately he's a big brute.
Yeah.
But anyway, they managed to escape.
Yes.
It's not easy, but they managed to.
They climb over Satan, and then they go up and they find the light.
So they're in purgatory.
Yes,
so they're in purgatory, which is essentially a mountain made up of the dirt that was displaced when Lucifer and the other fallen angels crashed into the middle of the earth, and shoot, there was the mountain. So, are the souls in who is in purgatory? The sinners in purgatory. How did they make it into purgatory? What's the difference between them and the sinners in hell?
I'm so glad you asked that, because Purgatorio is actually my favorite cantica, though it's not for everyone. So Purgatory is, I think, in some ways the most important and the most Catholic of, well, I would be the most Catholic, but the most important of all the cantica, because of all the three cantica, because in some ways it really is Dante's journey, because Dante is in Purgatorio. And the sinners we run into, so whether they are figures like Charles Martel or figures who come from sort of the historical tradition, whether they are figures who come out of a kind of sort of, not want to say mythology, but maybe biblical tradition or a sense of, kind of the local history in Dante's time. What's really important to remember is that these are individuals. They are sinners. We are all sinners. Even the people, even the souls who are in paradise, to some degree, I mean, they're all human.
Of course.
They're sinners. But the difference is that the souls in purgatory are the individuals who at some point, and mostly not just before death, like not the second before, but at some point in their lives took full recognition and accountability for what they had done. They began to see themselves as, I was the one who always cheated my brother, and then my brother died, and I had to really think about what was I doing with my life, and I felt sorry for that, or I had remorse for that. So the souls in purgatory are the individuals who sinned in life. Some of them had horrific sins, not unlike some in Inferno, but they recognized that in their lifetime. B, they were willing to not just recognize it, but also to take accountability, take responsibility. No, it wasn't because the sun was in my eyes, or he made me do it, or she made me do it. Yeah. I did this of my own volition. Yeah. Dante has a great, which I won't go into, but a great number of passages in Purgatorio about free will. And he's absolutely convinced that we sin only because we want to, that there's never a reason to sin other than on some level we want to. And so he feels very strongly that this is the cantica where he's going to show not just that there were sinners and they said, oops, sorry, and I really have to do better, but they also were willing to understand that they had to cultivate a new life. It's almost like they had to find a new path. And the beauty of it, of course, is that Dante goes through that with them. And that's why Purgatorio, I think, is very personal. It's a very beautiful.
Do you think that the Purgatorio is where Dante is most transformed in
Yes,
this journey?
absolutely. Because, remember the scenes where he has the P's, right, on his forehead for his poina. And it's only when he's able to, not just to say, oh, okay, I see what pride is. Oh, yeah, I intellectually understand what pride is. But he's able to, as he goes through the different sort of the levels, as he goes up the Mount of Purgatory, he runs into examples not just of pride and all these sins, but more importantly, he's given examples of the virtues. So he meets the humble person, he meets the gracious person, he meets the kind person, or people. There are usually 3 or 4 in each one. And Dante himself then begins to say, oh, so yeah, I kind of knew what pride was, but I'm still pretty prideful. And that's going to take a long journey for him to get rid of pride or anger. Anger and pride were his 2, big issues. But it's his own kind of journey. And when he gets finally to the end of Purgatory, or gets to the earthly paradise towards the end, and he thinks he's, all the P's are gone, and he's feeling good. And Beatrice shows up and says, are you kidding? You don't know anything. You need to rethink some things. I want to see tears of compunction.
And I want to get to that in 1 second, because now.
Oh, yeah, of course.
So Dante and Virgil make it through Purgatory.
Yes.
And Dante Spurgeon, he learns things. He was amazed, but then he understood why the sinners in Purgatory are happy to be.
Yes, that's exactly it, because they're able to redeem. Yes,
It's wonderful. It's really. It really does make you reflect, and no doubt.
It really does, yeah.
So they make it to what is called the earthly paradise,
right?
Which is kind of like the lobby of the real paradise,
if you will. Yeah, exactly.
It's the Garden of Eden.
Garden of Eden, essentially, right?
So, and Virgil can go there,
right?
So, I was really surprised by I wasn't so surprised as I was moved, because I think it's one of the most moving things that happen in the whole play, which is at some point, he meets, finally he encounters Beatrice for the first time in this journey, and Virgil is standing behind him.
Yes.
And they're talking, and suddenly he turns to talk to Virgil, and Virgil is gone.
Father Virgil is
gone. And very simply, it's not really elaborate, but very simply, you can feel the pain, and the sadness that Dante feels,
absolutely,
knowing that Virgil is not only gone, but it's gone forever, and that he's literally the man who walked through hell with him. Is gone. Like you said earlier, his lifelong hero,
companion,
and he's gone, and he's sad, and then Beatrice chastises him for it. Talk about. Am I right about this being a poignant moment? One of the most.
Yes. I mean, I would say that even talking to students, that everyone sort of focuses in on this moment when Dante's. It's not so much that he's lost reason or he's kind of lost that way. There's something about the intimacy of that relationship, and as you said, Virgil was with him. Virgil explained through all the darkest times. Virgil explained things to him. Virgil gave him hope. Virgil guided him. Even at points, Virgil said, "Well, I'm not quite sure what's happening either," but they did it together. And this notion of companionship, this notion of coming together, is something that, he loves Beatrice. He loves Beatrice, although at this point she's not obviously the Beatrice of the young woman he knew. This is almost an idealized version of Beatrice, and she does represent sort of his heart, and yet she is sterner. Virgil is a little kinder to Dante. Virgil says, I don't know what I guess it's pretty bad myself.
I mean, he literally carries him.
And every now and then he'll kind of say, come on, you got to wake up, or stop swooning all the time. Every time you see someone you thought you liked and it is there. But Beatrice really needs to check Dante and needs for him to check himself. And she said,
tough love.
She says to him, it's not just, in so many words, without getting the details, it's not just in your head, it has to be in your heart. And if you really want to make the next move and have the gift of this great, this grace to see this next vision, you have to find this kind of change within you that's true and authentic. And it's an interesting way in which he makes Beatrice out to be, sort of like a mother figure who really wants him to continue, wants to get better, but is still a bit angry at him that he's trying to let himself off too easy. And Dante even says, I need to find those tears of compunction. I need to do more than just, in my head, figure out, what it is to be, patient, or what it is to be generous.
And, as a quick aside, I had always thought before reading the Divine Comedy that the whole scheme had been Beatrice's idea, that it was she who had come up with the idea and then had asked Virgil to join in the project, got the okay from the higher powers, and carried out. But then I learned that no, this is the idea of the Virgin Mary,
Blessed Mother, yes,
that and that she in turn asked Saint Lucia to contact Beatrice, and then for Beatrice.
It's like a little network. The female trinity sometimes.
That's what they call it.
Yeah, that's what they call it then.
The Madonna Trinity.
Well, I know. I'm not saying it is a trinity. I'm not.
But that's what they call it.
But that's kind of the effect of it. Yes.
Why did Dante choose to do it that way?
Well, the medieval era, and I would say particularly in countries like Spain and Italy and France, so the Latin countries, but there was a deep, deep devotion to the Blessed Mother and the power of the Blessed Mother. You know, I know that today, particularly after Vatican II, we talk a lot about the idea of not venerating the Holy Mother and, you know, Blessed Mother, and there's language around her, the mediatrix, we don't like to use anymore. But to be fair, in Dante's time, Mary was the intercessor. Mary was our connection to the divine, and she's fully human, but she's perfect. And she is the one who, like our mother, will step in and say, this is what I need, you know, the guidance you need. And so she reaches out to Saint Lucia, you know, the saint of light and kind of awakening, and Beatrice. And it's you know, for someone like me, it's just kind of wonderful to have these three powerful female figures. Yeah. And Dante was always very, you know, there are a lot more, you know, a lot more opportunities for Dante to have done something else. But I think to show the power, the force of the sort of these women in his life and the effects that they have, and the Blessed Mother is ever with him. It's very, very important figure.
She plays a large part in the book.
It's lovely,
So in any event, the journey proceeds, and we discover that there are 9 circles in paradise as there were in hell, although here they're called spheres.
Spheres, right.
With each sphere populated by increasingly meritorious souls.
Right.
Does that mean that Dante believed that not all souls in heaven were equal, or not all equally happy?
Yeah, it depends how. There's a way of looking at where yes and the way no. So on one hand, Dante is as a sorry to keep using this, but really as a medieval person of the medieval culture, did have a sense of kind of hierarchy. There was a chain of being. There was a sense that there was kind of levels of being and so on. And certainly there are some figures like the Blessed Mother or some others who maybe merit a little closer connection to God, maybe than, let's say, Justinian or something like that. On the whole, though, and so there are some that, you know, there is a way of looking at it where it does seem to be somewhat hierarchical, but on the whole, everyone's just happy to be in. I mean, this is paradise, and at the end of the day, it's the light of God. So, I mean, personally, I'd be happy to be in any one corner of any one.
And they are too.
And they're all very happy.
And I think Dante asks that question, right? You know, and his answer is no, because the happiness that each feel is equal.
The presence of God. I mean, who cares whether you're off to the side or right? I mean, you know, the front. It's just there. Yeah. So, that's very much part of it. Yeah.
So, are there? Who are some of quickly, just if you could pick a couple, if you think there are a couple of the most interesting souls that he meets in paradise?
They're sort of, you know, it's interesting to me, I think, so they're the usual kind of, I don't know, the usual suspects. So you have some of the saints, you have Bernard of Clairvaux, you have Thomas, of course, you have Saint Benedict and so on. And I guess, I don't know the souls are as interesting in paradise as they are, at least in some of the cases, as they are in Inferno, and certainly
I feel the same way. I felt it was kind of like the Dante's version of the first sentence in Anna Karenina. You know, I wrote it down. Yeah. You know, Dante would say, all happy souls are like one another. Each unhappy soul is unhappy in his own way.
Yeah. But I think the interesting ones for me have always been some of the secular rulers. Like, I'm not, you know, I don't know, like Justinian and some of them. I think what's interesting, what really compels me about some of those souls is that they're very human. They led human lives. Mm-hmm. They weren't perfect, because no one is perfect, of course. And yet there was something about what they achieved, how they lived their, you know, how they did end up living their lives for the most part, what they were willing to sacrifice. There's a lot of sacrifice, a sense of that in paradise that, you know, allows them this, you know, incredible moment of grace where they're in the presence of God. So most of the souls in paradise, I think, would be, you know, they're usually the saintly figures, and then of course you get into sort of the Imperium, and they're just the most you know, translucent of all the earthly souls. And the ones who sort of stay in sort of the beginnings have more to do with, you know, Hugh Capet and some others who are sort of the kings and the rulers who did good, and lived good lives and were just and righteous and lived lives of virtue. They weren't perfect, but they certainly, deserve that kind of entryway.
Yeah, I was surprised to find Adam and Eve in heaven. I mean, they started the whole mess, but I was happy that they were there too.
And also because, there was a sense that there was a purity about them in the sense of how when they fell, is there really truly a sense that they even know they had fallen because they were just so innocent to everything in the world and their disobedience. So, and plus they, kind of achieved especially with Adam, kind of a new kind of understanding. So,
something else that surprised me is the limited appearances made by Jesus Christ. I mean, we see him as a symbol in the Garden of Eden, in the earthly paradise, and we see him in the final mystic vision of the triune God. But as the incarnate Jesus that we are familiar with, he makes one appearance in the last sphere before the Imperium, before where everything is like, and it's at a distance, and brief.
Right.
Why is it?
Well, I mean, I think it has something to do with a sort of a shifting of perspective, maybe from one culture to another. Not that Jesus was not front and center, of course, in the medieval world, but I think for Dante, the real focus was on the triune God. And the notion that, you could take, the Trinity, the idea of the three, the Purgatorio is Jesus, and God in the Inferno and so on, the judge and so on, that kind of thing. There are a lot of Trinitarian elements, but I think for Dante, what really was his journey wasn't so much that he lost his way even from Jesus, because there isn't that sense of that personal relationship that we talk about so much today. He's lost his way to God, just God, the triune God in general, the Holy Trinity in general, Jesus and the Holy Spirit and God. Yeah. And I think for Dante, that was the core of the journey, was to find his way back to the light of God. And along the way, again, not in any way to diminish Jesus, of course, but along the way to recognize, that Jesus plays an important role, but Dante's not even quite there yet. He's trying to just get back to that triune God and then find his way into the light. And Jesus, of course, is embedded in that.
Right. And he's talked about it in there, and he's given the opportunity to have that mystic vision of the triune God.
It's beyond words.
And I mean, it was so beautiful. I actually bought extra translations because I wanted to see it. I mean, the whole last couple of cantos in Paradise.
He's just beyond language.
Yes. No, I mean, and so he has that vision, a vision that he tries and fails to comprehend with his intellect. He calls it, I think he calls it something like trying to square a circle.
Right.
But which finally does break through.
Yes.
In some kind of mystical way, certainly not an intellectual way, that he says he doesn't have the words to fully convey it, but he tries to convey something.
Yeah.
What does he manage to convey of the God who, as he says in the final line of the poem, is, quote, the love that moves the sun and other stars?
And that's about, what his understanding of God is, and I think you said it so well. It's far beyond what theologians and writers want to talk about. This is the God of the cosmic God of the universe. This is the God who is as distant as the cosmos and as close to us as our own hearts. And what Dante realizes is that what you can't see, God is light. Deus is lux, right? God is light. God is everywhere. God permeates everything. God is present to us all the time, if only we can see. But it's also, as you said, it's a feeling, it's a sensibility, it's awareness that God is the love that courses through, whether it's a love between two people, the love for mother for child, the love we have for the, all of that sort of sense of love, that compassion, that attachment, all of that really for Dante resonates love. And for Dante, I think that was the biggest lesson of all, because he was a brilliant man. He was basically a good man. He had 5 or 6 kids. He was, a decent father. But I think trying to understand what love meant and what divine love means, and the love that brought him from the darkest to the light, and the love that carried him through, and all those people that loved him, and the love that he could give, that's really, I think, at the heart of his understanding of what God is. God is beyond our words, beyond our sight, beyond anything we could even say. And, I like that. I don't know if you do. I think it would cheapen it almost if he said, it was a light, it was flares, it was angel.
Right. No.
It's something altogether. Yeah.
Professor Greeley, the Christian author Rod Dreher wrote a book called How Dante Can Save Your Life.
Yes.
The life-changing wisdom of history's greatest poem. And this goes to the question we want to ask: what can we learn about from Dante today? And so let me ask you a question that I imagine some of my atheist and agnostic friends would probably ask, which is this. Can a work of literature steeped in a Catholic doctrine, which at the time was universally accepted in the Western world, and which was based on a cosmology that placed the Earth at the center of a relatively small universe, really change our lives in a world where it's basically post-Christian at best, and where we know that far from being the center of the universe, of a relatively small universe, we are an invisible speck in an unimaginably vast universe.
Sure.
Can he still change us? Can that still change?
In a word, yes. In a word, yes. And I believe the Holy Father recently sent a letter out, Pope Francis sent a letter out talking about literature. When we think about literature, we think about poetry, we're talking about the songs of the heart and of the mind and of the imagination and the creativity and inspiration, if you will, from the Holy Spirit. If people don't believe that, that's fine too. But it is a voice of a human. So if someone is an atheist or an agnostic, will they understand or like every single aspect of this? Probably not. And there are probably some Catholics or other people, some of it might be just too strange for them. But the notion that we are on a journey, the notion that we have these moments of darkness, the notion that with the help and love of others can guide us out of there, the notion that we need to be self-reflective, the idea that we need to sort of understand ourselves, recognize recognize others, understand our connection to others and relationship, and this idea of the utter optimism. It's a joyful poem. I mean, there are some really dark passages, but it's a joyful poem. And whether we're a speck of dust, we're still in God's eye, whether we're the center of the universe or not, maybe even more so, the wonder of it is even more so, speaking as a contemporary Catholic, that this is the kind of journey that we are all making or we should make. And I think anyone who,
that's my feeling. That's my feeling.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that enlivened my Catholic faith on reading this poem. It's because we are such a speck in this unimaginably vast universe that God created.
Exactly.
How happy does that make us that He is our God?
That's right, and that we don't have to be kings and princes. I mean, we can be, a poor poet who's lost his way, and yet somehow the Holy Spirit works and pulls us. So absolutely, I think it could speak to anybody and everybody. It's the great poem.
So you said earlier that you agree that it's the greatest Catholic work of literature.
It's the great poem, yes.
And it's the greatest poem written. You agree with that
think so.
too?
I think so.
Now, how about T.S. Eliot's claim that, quote, Dante and Shakespeare divide the world between them. There is no third. Would you go that far?
I would go that far, and I would say that the one difference might be is that Dante brings a kind of joy, the song of redemption. It's a comedy, right? So at the end, it does come out well. God is in His kingdom. Shakespeare's a little darker. Shakespeare's got a little bit more of, what do we do about these facets? But I would say, sure, if we had a world of just Dante and Shakespeare on a desert island, I think that would be all you need to know.
Can you ask a question that we like to ask?
Sure.
When did you first encounter the Divine Comedy? How did it affect your Catholic faith?
Sure.
And the way you look at the world?
So I was raised. I'm from Boston. I was raised in a very traditional Catholic family. I never read Dante till I went to college. I had a little bit when I was in high school, but in terms of really reading Dante, I was a medievalist and I was doing medieval literature. And someone said, "Oh, you should take a class on Dante." And of course, I had heard vaguely about Dante and I'd read a little bit of the Inferno. But the mistake people often make is to read just the Inferno, and we're not Calvinists, so we have to get into purgatory. And I just remember the first time reading it, which was 100 years ago. And I was floored. I was just floored. I had never read anything like it. And I started as a classicist, so I knew Virgil. I had read the Aeneid. I love epic poetry. But this is more than an epic poem. It's a story of a soul. And I just remember falling in love with it. So I ended up, after that class, and it was a traditional kind of class, so I studied it and did all that usual stuff. But then I started to read it on my own. And the one thing I would say about reading Dante is that you should never read it on your own the first time. It's a good book. It's a good poem to read with someone. Have a companion like Dante and Virgil to help you through it. But I just started reading it, and then I read it again, and then I read passages, and then I read some literature on it. And I've been doing that now for many, many years. I'm not going to say how many. And I write about it. I'm actually doing a paper now on Dante and nostalgia and the feeling of memory and the sense of memory in Purgatorio. And I teach it. And I think my students are kind of, I like to think they're for the better for it, but I don't know. They sort of look at me like, why do you like this so much?
So
but
obviously it had an effect, but how did it shake your vision of things? How did, how did it red pill you?
Well, I think for someone, not that I've always been very devout in my faith, I think, but there was something about Dante, especially in some of the passages that we won't go into, but there are passages where he really begins to ask questions about, so what does this really mean about free will, and what is love, and how do we understand the human person? And it was a young woman. These were questions I had. Not that they weren't being answered by places, people I knew, but there was something about his willingness to talk about that and yet do it in poetry and with all these beautiful elements. And I had a couple of Jesuit professors who kind of walked me through some of the deeper parts. And if anything, I don't want to say it strengthened my faith. It strengthened it, but it also solidified the glory, and I say that in a very specific way, of the Catholic literary tradition. It is a glorious piece of work. And I wouldn't say that there's no other tradition that could write this. That sounds a little bit unfair. But it truly is, I think, the expression of our Catholic faith writ in perfection.
All right. Very good. Let me just ask you one quick question.
Sure, of course.
If somebody's going to start reading this moved by our conversation, what's the translation we have? John Sciardi's translation?
I think Sciardi's a good one. Sciardi's a good one. He was an Italian studies scholar. He was a poet himself. It might not be the most perfect translation, but I think because he puts it into very, accessible English.
That's exactly right.
It works very well.
Well, Professor, it's been
Thank you so much for
a treat talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
And I hope someone out there, enjoys Dante.
Sure,
Have them write to us and we can start a club or something. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.